Hey everyone, thanks for joining me tonight. I'm not going to be playing the release version of the Sega Genesis version of Street Fighter Special Champion Edition for long. My main point tonight is to show off the prototype versions of this game. That we know of, there were three prototypes created for Street Fighter II Champion Edition before that would morph into Special Champion Edition. There was a prototype that was released in March of 1993, another prototype that was released in July of 93, and then one that was released in June of 94. However, it's the prevailing belief that these prototypes, while they were released in these months, were actually from code that was ready some months before. Generally speaking, the March prototype, most likely the code was from around December of 92, which is quite telling. Um, yeah, just imagine we could have had Street Fighter Champion Edition on the Genesis in '92, um, and then the July version prototype from July of '93. Most likely that code was from February or March of that year, before Sega decided that they didn't like what they saw and told Capcom to fix it. And Capcom went into high gear, quote unquote, fixed it, and gave us this version of Special Champion Edition, which I'm about to launch into and play. I'm going to pick Champion Edition because that's what all the prototypes are centered around. And then the third prototype was actually released in June of '94. The hunch there is that the developer that Capcom decided not to go with just kept working on the game in-house, and at some point released what they felt was their best effort. Who knows what the actual date on that best effort was, but regardless, this version of the game that I'm playing right now is the one that we got. And, it's not a bad version of the game. The audio is complete garbage, but the gameplay is great. In fact, I'd argue the gameplay on the Genesis version of this game is better than the Super Nintendo version. Just the timing of the moves and how everything feels is just a little bit tighter. So before I get into the prototypes, I would just like to mention where you can actually find them. There's a video game history website out there called hiddenpalace.org. That's hiddenpalace.org. If I flub that up later on in the video, just remember hiddenpalace.org. I'll leave links below in the description as well to the prototypes. Don't worry, you don't need any other game ROMs to play the prototypes. You just need to fire up your favorite emulator, your favorite flash cartridge. However you play Sega Genesis games that don't come to you in cartridge form, you can get them to work. I highly recommend if you're short on time, check out the July '93 prototype, as that one is pretty much feature complete. It's a little rough, but still, I would call it 95% done. So I'm just going to play through this level on the retail version of Special Champion Edition that we got September of '93, so you can kind of get the background of what we got and the background for comparison. Definitely pay attention to the audio differences and also some of the animation differences, particularly in Ryu's stance here. All right, and with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the prototypes. All right, so what we have here is the Street Fighter prototype from March 25th, 1993. We'll just jump right into it here. I don't intend to spend a lot of time on this one. as it's the July prototype that I find the most interesting. Pick reuse alternate color. The main things you're going to want to pay attention to are the audio and the cutscenes, really. So by now you've noticed that the voices are just as scratchy as in the released version of the game. And there are all these interesting whiff sound effects for moves, kind of like punches and kicks cutting through the air. And also that loud countdown timer that wasn't in the final version of the game. And of course the life bars at the top, they're not, the black area is not transparent. But really, when you take a look at it, it's pretty impressive to think that this was a prototype that got canned. Sega told Capcom to go back to the drawing board, basically, because Capcom had been farming this game out to a third party, and they weren't happy with this particular version, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. The sound isn't all that much different from the release version. And the one thing to keep in mind, the animation is pretty solid when you consider that this is a 2 megabyte or a 16 megabit cartridge. The release version of the game was 24 megabits, so they had an extra, they had 33% more space to play with in the final version. Another thing I'd like to point out too is the character models, well, I guess they're not models, the character sprites definitely are not the same as those found in the Super Nintendo and Genesis release versions of the game. I don't know if they used the PC Engine sprites or if they uh, reformatted the arcade sprites, but the graphics and animation are more in line with what they looked like in the arcade game, just shrunken down and a little bit rougher. Yeah, even though the prototype ROM date is March 25th of 93, just from what I know of game development, this version of the game was probably burned for the first time, I would guess, sometime in December of 92, maybe even January of 93, but Sega and Capcom wouldn't have had time to can this version of the game and start from scratch and come up with a full release version of the game in 7 months' time, which is actually 6 months' time, which is basically what happened. So most likely this version of the game was really from December of 92, which makes this all the more impressive, because even though we knew that Nintendo was going to get Hyper Fighting the following summer, this is not... I mean, really, apart from the life bars at the top of the screen, this isn't really that much worse, and in many ways it's better than the Nintendo version of Street Fighter The World Warrior that was out at the time. The music definitely is an acquired taste. Some of it's better, some of it's worse. Trying not to talk too much over this because I want to really highlight the game's audio. Yeah, I've played through this particular prototype a couple of times. All of the characters' endings are there. They're a bit rougher than what was in the release version, but they're all there. All of the moves seem to be present. The animation is mostly there. Actually, I think this game has more animation in it than the release version. One thing I do notice is that the game balance is a bit different than Champion Edition was back in the day. The damage that the moves do isn't the same, and at least playing single player, it feels like the human player does about half the damage of normal. Which I could see them doing that intentionally to prolong the game. It's not how the release version was, though, so it's an interesting change. The loser portraits show a lot more blood and guts in them than in the release version, even though Sega's version of Special Champion Edition at least had bloody portraits. The bats are missing from Ryu's stage here. Ryu's AI is definitely spot on. It's aggressive. And actually, most of the AI is already programmed into the game. There are some rough edges to it, but it's mostly on point with what it was in the arcade. Which again, under normal circumstances, I'd say that this is probably an 80% complete version of Street Fighter II Champion Edition. Champion Edition for the Genesis. But since Sega wasn't happy about it and made Capcom go back to the drawing board, this got tossed in the can and Capcom started over again. And it's not like they really started from scratch. They did have the graphics assets and the code for the Super Nintendo version of the game, so it was easy enough for them to port that. And somehow, in the release version of the game, we did still end up with a little bit more animation and more audio than was in the Super Nintendo version of Hyper Fighting, so it's not like Capcom totally half-assed it, even though the audio, granted, was rough in every single version of the game that came out for the Genesis. I'm going to play Honda here, and then I'm going to move on to the next prototype. All right, and this is the July 1993 Street Fighter II Champion Edition prototype. I'm going to spend a bit more time with this one, as this one's the most fleshed out of the prototypes, at least of the what I would call the true prototypes. There's one more prototype I have coming up that was finalized after the release version of the game, but this one was burned and distributed in July of 1993. Considering the game, the commercial version of the game came out in September of 93 and is totally different from this. My guess is that this version was probably, I'd say, from March or April of 93 and just happened to have another copy burned to ROM sometime in July. Um, the history of the game is that Sega was unhappy with what Capcom had farmed out, and so in order to fulfill their contract, Capcom had to start from scratch. And there's no way they're going to start from scratch on Street Fighter II Champion Edition, throw hyper fighting into it, get it debugged, and get it out in what would have been, well, if the date on this was correct, 2 months' time, but even 6 months' time. So most likely these prototypes were, even though they have dates on them from March and July of 93, I'd say the latest one of these could have been passed by Sega and nixed would have been maybe January or February of 92. Or sorry, January or February of 93. One of the prototypes I'm pretty sure was really from December of 92. Because, yeah, these prototypes are from early to mid 93, but the game itself came out in September of 93 and was totally different. So what we have here as the CPU is doing its demo is you can see that the life bars have been improved from the previous version. There's still that black strip at the top, but the life bars are a lot more pleasant to look at. The audio is better. It sounds very close to what we heard in the release version of the game. Maybe the sound effects are a little bit clearer, actually. So I'm going to get started here, and I'm going to play this one for a much longer duration. I think this time I will pick... would be a good one to pick here. Let's pick my boy Ken. Still, the announcer doesn't announce the countries. He does say fight, but he doesn't announce the rounds. The boxes on Guile's stage are about half the size what they were in the release version. This version still uses the reformatted arcade graphics. You can tell because things aren't quite in the right proportion, but the animation is better than in the release version of the game. Ken and Ryu bopping up and down is smoother. That purple line going down the middle of Guile's stage is so distracting. Would it have killed whoever is making this game to make it blue like in the release version? Like, were they having that much trouble getting colors out of the Genesis? Again, very bloody character portraits. The AI in this version of the game is a lot closer to the release version's AI, falls for most of the same tricks. I'm actually surprised that Sega wasn't happy with this version of the game. The audio is by no means worse than the release version. I actually like some of the music in this version better. The fonts are kind of lame, but they could have fixed those. The amount of damage some of these moves does is insane. The damage output between the March and July prototypes is changed a little bit, but still most of the moves are doing even more damage than they did in the arcade. At least the CPU. One difference between Zangief's stage in this version versus the release version of the game is the chain isn't hanging down in front of the characters. It's so wild to be playing a version of Street Fighter 2 that was in progress, never released, but also realizing that had they just been quicker out of the gate with this version of the game, they probably could have released this and made tons of cash. I mean, they were behind the eight ball. They were producing this game with the knowledge that Nintendo was going to have Hyper Fighting coming out for their system in the summer of '93, and Sega coming out with Champion Edition would have just been bad juju at that time. But if this had come out for the holiday of '92, for example, yeah, people would have made fun of it a little bit for having the black strip at the top. That's kind of rough looking compared to other fighting games on the Super Nintendo and even later fighting games on the Genesis. But really, that's the only flaw that separates this from the World Warrior on Super Nintendo. And can you imagine this version of the game coming out 6 months or so after the Super Nintendo version of World Warrior, allowing you to play as 4 extra characters, using Sega's 6-button controller? and generally being the complete Street Fighter II Champion Edition experience, except for some rough edges. I'm exploiting Zangief's AI here. For most home versions of Street Fighter console 16-bit games, if you just jump backwards, Zangief can't help but move in and take a foot to the face. The interesting thing about the car bonus stage in both of the prototypes is that you don't gain control of your character immediately. There's a noticeable pause before you can actually start doing anything. Something's up with Dhalsim's music track in this stage. There's just something that ain't right about it. I don't know if it's that it's slower paced or missing a couple instruments, it just sounds weird. I'm going to see if I can't play through this version of the game all the way through so we can see one of the endings. I may lose once or twice to Bison, though. Even in the release version of the game, Bison's CPU AI has caused me problems in the past. But I have played through this version a couple times, and all of the endings are there. You even get the little bonus congratulations if you beat the game without either losing a round or without losing a match. One thing that's definitely superior in the release version of the game is hits just sound better. Maybe that's why Sega put the kibosh on this version of the game instead of having them upgrade it. They took one listen to it and realized it didn't have that familiar Sega bass line to it. Told them to go back and do it all over again. Guess the development team didn't have any 808s lying around. Ken has that devastating hard punch into dragon punch combo in this prototype. The previous one, it doesn't seem to come off as easily, and the damage is inconsistent. But in this one, it's pretty consistent. If you can do a fierce punch followed immediately by a dragon punch, you can take off a ton of life. Honda's AI is much closer to the release version of the game. It's not as aggressive as it was in the March 93 prototype. Although he will throw you. I just love this bathhouse stage. Prototype, release version, whatever. Honda has one of the best Street Fighter stages. Another difference, even though it's a detail, is the countdown, the score countdown is a lot quieter in this version than the March prototype. But the other difference is you can actually hit the button to speed it up. In the March prototype, hitting the button didn't seem to do a thing to speed up the score countdown. And I felt kind of punished for racking up high scores in that game. At least my ears were punished. That hut in the background is ridiculously long. I feel like it was shorter in the March prototype, longer in this prototype, and then at least not a giant longhouse. And yeah, you'll notice that Blanca comboed me from his bite into a slash without me having a chance to block. I can't remember if that was legit from Champion Edition, but yeah. This version of the game, some moves combo into different moves than you might be used to. I will say, though, if you're going to track down a prototype version of Street Fighter, this is the one to play. The July 93 version. So yeah, hit up the sites that I mentioned in the intro to this piece and in the description to this video if you want to find the prototype versions of these games. Don't worry, the sites don't have the release version of the game, just the prototypes. You don't have to do any patching or anything like that, just download them and play them in your favorite emulator on your favorite flash cart. Heck, play them in the least favorite flash cart that you have. No one's going to know. Blanca is hella aggressive in this. But of course, that aggressiveness can be exploited. This bonus stage is pretty much identical to the one in the previous prototype. Um, the barrels are just have a bit more color to them. A little bit more bounce, too. $18 out of 20, that's about my par. I was never very good at that bonus stage. Alright, and now we're on to the bosses. The girls with their hats, they're a bit more curvy than in the release version of the game. And they're also in the middle of the stage as opposed to off to the right side there where they were in the release version of the game. In the March prototype, Balrog isn't as aggressive. In this version, he's pretty similar to the way he is in the release version of the game. Ouch. One big difference in this stage you'll notice from the release version is none of the signs in the background are are lighting up, not the Capcom sign, not the Golden Goose sign. Only the casino signs. And you'll notice the doves don't fly out of the girls' hats, and there's no confetti either. The one nice thing about Balrog is you mostly just need to stay low. It's not a 100% guarantee, but it beats a punch to the head. Vega and Sagat stages that are coming up are pretty close to the release versions. Um, there's a little bit less background detail, which you'll notice if you're familiar with the game. I'll point it out, but these are pretty close. They were never very busy stages to begin with. So Vega's got his dancers, he's got his spectators. Everything's just a little bit larger than in the release version of the game because, again, they took the arcade graphics and scaled them down, which is also why the color palette's a little bit dithered. They didn't have time to optimize the colors before Sega pulled the plug on this version of the game. The colors of the spectators in the background are a little bit different as well. Mostly the ladies' dresses. The melody and the background music on this stage is particularly good for a Genesis game. I find that true of most of the music as well. Like, a lot of the music in this version of the game is more rich even than in the version that we got. Which is crazy to believe when you think about it, because when they released the game it was 24 megabits, which is 3 megabytes, and this prototype is 16 megabits or 2 megabytes. So how did the music and audio get a downgrade, even though they added more space? And again, it just comes down to Capcom having to rush against time and also not being as versed in the Genesis hardware yet. Because as the recent ROM hacks have shown, the Genesis versions of Street Fighter could have had crystal clear audio. Sagat's pretty much the same as he was in the release version. His Tiger Uppercut does major damage. I think it actually is less vulnerable too. I don't know why I jumped there. Probably because I was talking. We'll give Sagat a chance to have a victory. If not for the extra dithering on the grass and the jaggedness to the temples in the far background, this would almost pass for the release version of the game with regard to Sagat stage. Gosh, I still can't believe that they didn't release this version of the game. Just a matter of timing. Can you imagine if this had come out during the holiday season of '92? I would have bought it for the Genesis. I would have bought this for the Genesis in December of '92, January or February of '93, no problem. And I knew I was going to be buying Hyper Fighting by that point on the Super Nintendo. Yeah, there was that long period there where those of us with home consoles, we were stuck with basically the Super Nintendo version of the game. And then, going to the arcade where we could play a Champion Edition and Hyper Fighting. And it was quite jarring to go home and play a version of the game that only let you play 8 characters and was really slow. And then you'd go to the arcade and you'd play a game that let you play 12 characters or 12 characters and do mid-air special moves. All right, let's see if I can catch Bison in the trap. Nope. Bison is no joke in this version of the game. All of his moves have a bit more invulnerability to them. I knew he was going to give me trouble, though. We might get to see the lose portrait for Ken here, so we can see that. Yep, okay, we'll get to see the lost portrait. That's okay. That's okay, I'm still getting my bearings. Alright, just look at Ken, his eyes. They're not even right. Guess I better hit start. Alright, we'll pick up with Ken again. That means I won't get to see the special congratulations message, but that's okay. Yeah, Bison's a bit tougher to beat because he doesn't fall for the hurricane kick over him as much as he did in the release version of the game. It's one of the tricks I used to rely on against the CPU. Also, his cross-ups are amazing. He just has amazing priority and cross-up in this version of the game. Which is kind of what you want from a final boss of a fighting game. You don't want him to be a wuss. I think I got this. He's locked in his torpedo now. Alright, one more round. One more round! Ouch. It's actually tough because it's hard to do the reverse into the kick. That's what I'm talking about, the less damage, though. You notice I had to do 2 sweeps to knock him out, even though he had no health. So the ending's very similar to the release version, except Eliza doesn't actually walk up to Ken. And we didn't get the scene there of Ken and Eliza in their tuxedo and wedding dress. So that's the July prototype of Street Fighter II Champion Edition, the July 93 prototype. Now that I've run through that, I'm going to play the last prototype that I've run across for this game. It's actually from 94, but that's when it was burned, so it technically was released after the retail version of the game. But we'll take a look at that and we'll talk about that in a minute here. All right, and now the last prototype we're going to be playing, although not really a prototype since it came out after the release version of the game, is from June of 1994. As you can see, it says ST2-Turbo, but it's not really Turbo, it's still Champion Edition. I'm not sure what the genesis of this particular prototype was. My guess is someone at the original developer that Capcom hired decided they were going to put some finishing touches on their version of the game, maybe to sell it to a Chinese company to bootleg, or maybe just for their own personal amusement. As you can see here, the computer fighting Balrog versus Balrog. The background doesn't really have any more animation than the previous versions of the game, but the life bars are now over the field of play, and there's no black strip up there anymore. All right, let's give this a quick play for a couple minutes, and then we'll conclude. Yep, you heard right. The audio is crystal clear, isn't it? It's not perfect. Sometimes the sound effects cut each other out, but the voices are much clearer than they were in the release version of the game, which just goes to show we could have had much better audio in the Genesis version of Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition. And for that matter, Super Street Fighter II. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that if you want to try out these prototypes for yourself, you can do so by visiting hiddenpalace.org. I'll leave links in the description below to the specific ROM files. Again, you're not going to find the release version of the game there. You don't need to patch anything. You can just download and play the dumped ROMs as is. And many thanks to hiddenpalace.org for making these available and keeping this part of Street Fighter history alive. I'm going to play one more match after Zangief here, and then I'm going to call it a day. Can you just imagine if Sega had been able to release this specific version of the game 6 to 9 months prior to when they actually released Champion Edition? Or at least their Special Champion Edition? I know, the what-ifs boggle the mind. I really like the music in this version of the game. I actually think it's better than what Sega released for the actual retail copy. Alright, as I finish off Dhalsim here, I just want to thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them, and I'll do my best to respond. And look forward to future videos in my Frank Play series where I'll tackle games that are either important to me or significant in some way. At least I think so. And until next time, take care, everybody!